You know what's fascinating? Most people assume that missing someone is a universal human experience, that it's automatic, that if you don't feel that ache when someone's gone, something must be fundamentally wrong with you. But here's the thing nobody talks about. There's a specific psychological profile of people who just don't miss others the way everyone else seems to. And it's not because they're cold. It's not because they lack empathy. It's because their brain has organized attachment, memory, and emotional presence in a completely different architecture. And if you're watching this right now, there's a high probability you're one of these people. You've probably wondered if you're broken. You've probably felt guilty about it. You've maybe even tried to force yourself to feel something you simply don't. What you're going to understand today changes everything about how you see yourself, your relationships, and what it actually means to care about someone. Because missing someone and caring about someone are not the same thing. And your brain knows that, even if the culture around you pretends they are. Let's start with what most people believe, that missing someone is proof of love, that longing equals depth, that if you don't feel that emotional pull when someone's absent, you must not have valued them enough. This is one of the most damaging myths in modern psychology. Because what it does is it pathologizes a completely valid way of experiencing connection. It turns a neurological difference into a moral failure. And worse, it makes people like you perform emotions they don't actually feel, just to fit into a narrative that was never designed for how your mind works. Here's what's actually happening. When most people form attachments, their brain creates what's called an anticipatory reward circuit. Essentially, the presence of the person becomes associated with dopamine release. The brain starts to predict their presence, and when they're gone, there's a gap, a deficit. The brain craves the return of that stimulus. This is why most people experience missing someone as a physical sensation. It's not poetic, it's neurochemical. Their brain is literally in withdrawal from a pattern it had learned to expect. But not everyone's brain operates this way. Some people, and this includes you, form what's called object permanence-based attachment. You don't need the constant sensory reinforcement of someone's presence to maintain the emotional reality of the relationship. The connection exists independently of proximity. You know they exist. You know you care. But your brain doesn't generate longing as a byproduct of absence. And this sounds contradictory, but it's actually a more stable form of attachment in many ways. Because think about it. If your emotional experience of someone is entirely dependent on their physical or communicative presence, then your sense of connection is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant validation, constant input. But if your brain can hold the reality of that person without needing them to actively trigger your reward system, you've internalized the relationship in a way that doesn't collapse under distance. Neuroscience explains why this happens. Research into attachment styles and dopaminergic sensitivity shows that people with lower baseline dopamine reactivity to social stimuli tend to form what we call cognitive bonds, rather than affective bonds. Your connection to people lives more in your understanding of them, your respect for them, your intellectual and philosophical alignment with them, than in the emotional high of their presence. This doesn't mean you feel less. It means you feel differently. And if you've made it this far, if this is resonating, then you're probably the kind of person who values depth over frequency, who can go months without speaking to someone and pick up exactly where you left off, who doesn't need constant check-ins to know a relationship is real. And that's not a flaw. That's a feature. But the world doesn't make space for people like you, so you learn to apologize for it. You learn to say, "I'm bad at keeping in touch," when what you really mean is, "I don't experience connection the same way you do," and that's okay. If you're someone who thinks about the world this way, who questions the narratives everyone else accepts, you'll probably find a lot of value in this channel. Because we don't do surface-level psychology here. We go into the mechanisms, the patterns, the things most people never stop to examine. So if that sounds like you, consider subscribing. Not because I need you to, but because you might need a space where your way of thinking is actually the norm. Now let's go deeper into what's really happening in your brain when someone leaves your life and you just don't feel that pull. There's a concept in neuroscience called hedonic adaptation, and it's usually applied to things like money or pleasure. Basically, your brain gets used to things. It recalibrates. What was once exciting becomes baseline. But this same mechanism applies to people. When someone is consistently in your life, your brain stops treating their presence as a novel stimulus. It integrates them into your psychological landscape. They become part of your expected environment. And here's where it gets interesting. For most people, when that person is removed, the brain notices the absence because it had learned to predict the presence. But for people like you, the brain doesn't encode people as environmental stimuli in the first place. You encode them as concepts, as entities with independent existence. Your relationship with them isn't contingent on sensory reinforcement. It's conceptual, philosophical, abstract. This is why you can care deeply about someone and also not think about them for weeks, because in your mental model, they don't need to be thought about to continue existing. They're not a stimulus. They're a permanent object in your psychological universe. And this is more serious than it seems because it means your entire experience of relationships is built on a foundation most people don't even recognize as possible. Think about how most relationships are maintained: through regular contact, texts, calls, shared experiences. The relationship is kept alive by continuous interaction, and if that interaction stops, the relationship fades. People drift apart. They say things like, "We lost touch," but you don't experience drift the same way, because your sense of connection isn't tied to interaction frequency. You cannot speak to someone for a year and still consider them one of your closest friends, because the friendship exists independently of the communication. This creates a strange asymmetry, doesn't it? Because other people don't understand this. They think your silence means you don't care. They think your lack of longing means you've moved on, and you're left trying to explain something that doesn't fit into the language they use to describe relationships. So let's talk about two very different psychological profiles when it comes to attachment and memory. There are people who experience relationships as events, and there are people who experience relationships as states. Event-based relational thinkers need the relationship to be actively happening to feel its reality. Every conversation is a renewal of the bond. Every shared moment is proof that the connection exists. And when those events stop, the relationship starts to feel unreal. This is why they miss people, because the absence of events feels like the absence of the relationship itself. State-based relational thinkers, on the other hand, experience relationships as ongoing conditions. The relationship is a fact. It doesn't need to be reproven with every interaction. It exists as a stable element of their psychological reality. This is why they don't miss people the same way, because the relationship hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. The person is just not physically present at the moment, and neither of these is better or worse. They're just different operating systems. But if you're state-based, you've probably spent your whole life being told you're doing relationships wrong, that you're distant, that you're avoidant, that you don't care enough. And that's not true. You care. You just don't need the same evidence of caring that other people do. And this ties directly into how you allocate empathy, how you construct identity, and how you derive self-worth. Because here's another layer. People who rarely miss anyone tend to have what psychologists call an internalized locus of emotional stability, meaning your sense of okayness doesn't depend on other people being around. You're not using relationships to regulate your emotional state. You're not outsourcing your sense of wholeness to someone else's presence. Most people do this without realizing it. They feel better when they're around certain people. They feel worse when those people are gone. Their emotional baseline is directly tied to their relational environment. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a completely valid way to be human. But you're different. Your emotional baseline is internally generated. You can be alone for long stretches and feel completely fine, Not because you're disconnected from others, but because your brain doesn't require external input to maintain stability. And this has massive implications for identity, because if you're not constantly checking your sense of self against other people's presence, then your identity is more self-authored. You're not shaped as much by your social environment. You don't absorb other people's expectations as easily. You're more immune to social pressure, to groupthink, to the need to belong. And that can feel alienating, because most people are building their identity in collaboration with others. They're figuring out who they are by seeing themselves reflected in relationships, and you're just not doing that. You're building your sense of self from the inside out, which means you probably felt different from a very young age. You probably noticed that you didn't need friends the way other kids seemed to, that you could be perfectly content on your own. And maybe people told you that was sad, that you should want to be around others more, that something was missing, but nothing was missing. You were just wired differently. And here's where we have to talk about where this actually comes from. Because these psychological patterns don't appear out of nowhere. They have origins. And those origins are almost always tied to early experiences of independence, observation, or mild social exclusion. A lot of people who rarely miss anyone report having been, as children, the kid who was okay playing alone, the kid who didn't cry when their parents left the room, the kid who seemed unusually self-sufficient, and sometimes this was celebrated. Oh, they're so independent. But other times it was pathologized. Are they okay? Why don't they need me more? And what happens is, your brain learns early that you're capable of existing without constant external validation. You learn that being alone isn't a problem to be solved, and that becomes your baseline. But there's another path, too. Some people who rarely miss anyone went through early experiences of inconsistency or emotional unavailability. Not necessarily trauma, just people not being reliably present. And the brain adapted. It learned not to depend on others for emotional continuity. It learned to self-soothe, to self-stabilize. And this isn't a wound that needs healing. It's an adaptation that made you resilient. Because the ability to not need others constantly is a profound form of strength. It means you can lose people without losing yourself. It means you can be alone without being lonely. It means your happiness isn't contingent on someone else's choices. But the culture doesn't frame it that way. The culture frames it as coldness, as emotional unavailability, as a deficit. And so you internalize that narrative. You start to believe that your way of relating is less than, that you're missing out on something everyone else has access to. But you're not missing out. You're just experiencing connection on a different axis. And that axis is often more about meaning than feeling. Because here's what's fascinating. People who rarely miss anyone often have incredibly rich inner lives. They're the ones reading philosophy at 2 a.m. They're the ones thinking about systems, patterns, ideas. They're the ones who can spend hours alone and not feel bored because their mind is a universe unto itself. And this is where meaning comes from for you, not from shared experiences, not from emotional highs, but from understanding, from depth, from the pursuit of something that feels true. Most people derive meaning from their relationships, from the roles they play in other people's lives, from being needed, from being remembered, from being missed. But you derive meaning from something more abstract, from the quality of your thinking, from the integrity of your choices, from the coherence of your internal world. You're not a spectator, you're a creator. You're not waiting for life to happen to you through other people. You're authoring your existence from a place of internal clarity, and that's a fundamentally different way of being in the world. Now, there's a state of consciousness that people like you access more easily than most. And it's called flow. Flow is that state where you're completely absorbed in what you're doing. Time disappears. Self-consciousness disappears. You're just present, engaged, alive. And research shows that people who can tolerate solitude, who don't need constant social stimulation, tend to enter flow states more frequently. Because flow requires a kind of mental space that's hard to access when you're constantly seeking external validation or managing relational anxiety. You can be alone with a task, a thought, a project, and lose yourself in it completely. And that's where you feel most real. Not in the presence of others, but in the presence of your own focused attention. And this explains so much about why you don't miss people the way others do. Because your sense of aliveness doesn't come from connection. It comes from immersion, from depth, from engagement with something that challenges and absorbs you. Other people need relationships to feel alive. You need presence, not the presence of others, but your own presence, your own awareness, your own consciousness fully engaged with something meaningful. And that's not a lesser way of living. It's just a different one. But the world is built for people who need others. The world assumes that everyone wants to be surrounded, to be noticed, to be remembered. And when you don't want those things the same way, you're treated as an outlier. But you're not broken. You're not missing a piece of your humanity. You're not incapable of love. You just love differently. You connect differently. You experience presence differently. And the truth is, your way of being has advantages most people never consider. You're less likely to stay in relationships out of fear, because you're not afraid of being alone. You're less likely to tolerate bad behavior just to avoid the discomfort of missing someone, because you don't experience that discomfort the same way. You're more likely to have relationships that are based on genuine compatibility, not on need, because you're not using other people to fill a void. You're choosing them because they add something real to your life, not because you can't function without them. And you're more likely to maintain your sense of self in relationships, because you're not merging your identity with someone else. You're staying whole, staying clear, staying you. This is a quiet strength. It's not celebrated. It's not romanticized in movies or songs, but it's real. And the people who understand it, who live it, don't need it to be celebrated. Because they're not performing for an audience. They're just being. So, if you've ever felt guilty about not missing someone you're supposed to miss, stop. If you've ever felt like something's wrong with you because you don't feel that ache, let it go. If you've ever tried to force yourself to feel longing just to prove you're capable of it, you can stop now, because you're not defective. You're not emotionally stunted. You're not cold. You're just wired for a different kind of depth. A depth that doesn't require constant proximity. A depth that exists in understanding, in respect, in the quiet knowledge that someone matters to you even when they're not in front of you. And that's not only valid, it's valuable. It's a way of loving that doesn't demand, that doesn't cling, that doesn't collapse under distance. And in a world that equates love with need, that's almost radical. So here's what I want you to take from this. You're not alone in this. There are others who experience relationships the way you do, who don't miss people the way the world says they should, who care deeply and also feel perfectly fine in solitude. And you don't owe anyone an explanation for that. You don't have to justify why you don't text back immediately, why you don't feel the need to check in constantly, why you can go weeks without thinking about someone and still consider them important. Because your relationships are real, they're just not performed. They're not maintained through constant contact. They're maintained through something deeper, something that doesn't need reinforcement to stay true. And that's a gift, not a flaw. If this resonated with you, if you've spent years thinking you were the only one who felt this way, there's more where this came from. Because understanding yourself isn't a one-time thing. It's a practice. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology of people who think differently, who feel differently, who exist outside the narratives everyone else accepts, you'll find that here. So take this with you. You're not broken. You're not missing anything. You're just operating on a different frequency, and that frequency is exactly where you're supposed to be.